The rock on Mount Roraima began forming nearly 2 billion years ago. It was already ancient before complex animals filled the seas. Today, its summit rises high above the forest behind enormous sandstone walls and clouds. For generations, the mountain looked like a sealed world, almost completely separated from everything below. But DNA would eventually challenge that idea. Mount Roraima does not look like a normal mountain. Instead of rising to a sharp peak, it rises like a fortress. Its sides climb almost vertically, while the summit looks remarkably flat, as though someone cut the top off an enormous block of stone. Roraima stands near the meeting point of Venezuela, Brazil, and Guyana. It belongs to a group of mountains called tepuis. These are enormous, flat-topped sandstone plateaus that tower above the surrounding forests like islands floating in the sky. From a distance, Roraima looks almost unreal. Clouds gather around its edges, waterfalls pour from its cliffs, and dark rock disappears into mist. The entire mountain can look less like part of Earth and more like a fragment of another planet. The summit covers roughly 31 square kilometers. That is enough room for streams, pools, plants, animals, and strange geological formations to exist far above the surrounding forest. But the most incredible part may be its age. Some of the sandstone belongs to the ancient Guyana Shield and dates to roughly 1.95 to 1.78 billion years ago. When those sediments formed, Earth was almost unrecognizable compared with today. There were no forests covering the continents. There were no birds, mammals, or dinosaurs. Complex ecosystems as we know them had not yet appeared. Roraima's geological history reaches back to a world almost impossible for us to imagine. Over immense periods of time, layers of sediment accumulated, hardened, lifted, and were gradually attacked by wind and water. The surrounding landscape eroded away, while resistant sections remained. Eventually, isolated flat-topped mountains were left behind. That makes Roraima more than an ancient mountain. It is a survivor. It is a remaining fragment of a much larger landscape that has been slowly erased over geological time. Long before scientists arrived, the local Pemon people already knew these mountains. The tepuis were not considered ordinary cliffs. The word tepui is often translated as House of the Gods, reflecting their importance in local traditions. One Pemon story connects Roraima with a giant tree that once held the world's fruits and vegetables. The tree was eventually cut down, changing the landscape. Myth and geology speak differently, but there is an interesting connection. The tepuis really did originate from a much larger connected landscape. Today, those ancient plateaus are separated by enormous areas of forest. To anyone approaching Roraima, however, the geological history would be less obvious than the enormous cliffs standing directly ahead. For most of recorded history, reaching the summit was effectively impossible for outsiders. The cliffs rise hundreds of meters, and rain and mist make the rock wet and slippery. The mountain seemed to have built its own natural barrier. That isolation helped create legends. When people cannot reach a place, imagination fills the gap. Roraima became a perfect setting for stories about hidden worlds and mysterious landscapes. In 1884, British explorer Everard M. Thurn, traveling with Harry Perkins and supported by crucial local knowledge, found a natural sloping route to the summit. The route was difficult, but it proved that the mountain could be entered. That discovery changed everything. Roraima was no longer simply a distant silhouette. Explorers could finally climb onto the summit and discover what existed above those enormous cliffs. The journey was anything but easy. Travelers had to cross savanna and forest, deal with rain and mud, and approach a mountain that seemed to grow larger without becoming easier to reach. Eventually, the cliffs would dominate the sky. Water would run down dark rock. Moss would cover cracks, and clouds would surround the mountain. The final climb involved slippery surfaces and careful movement along the natural route. At the summit, explorers found a landscape unlike ordinary mountain terrain. Instead of soft grasslands, the ground consisted largely of hard sandstone, shaped by endless rainfall. Water had carved the rock into channels, ridges, pools, and hollows. The strange terrain was not simply beautiful. It created the environmental conditions that determined which organisms could survive. The summit can be cold, windy, and extremely wet. Soil is thin in many areas, and although water is plentiful, nutrients can be difficult to obtain. Life, therefore, has to survive under surprisingly harsh conditions. That is where Roraima becomes a biological puzzle. Isolation combined with environmental pressure can create unusual adaptations. When organisms are separated from populations elsewhere, evolution can take them in unexpected directions. Scientists eventually documented plants and animals found nowhere else. These are known as endemic species. Roraima and the surrounding tepuis became famous for this highly specialized life. Some plants became carnivorous. Because the soil can provide limited nutrients, these plants developed ways of capturing insects and using them as an additional source of nutrition. Some frogs also use these plants. Water trapped inside them can provide shelter and create small habitats in places where suitable water sources are otherwise limited. Then there's the famous pebble toad. It is tiny, dark, and easy to mistake for a piece of rock. But when threatened, this little amphibian has one of the strangest escape behaviors in nature. Most frogs jump when they are attacked. The pebble toad does something very different. It pulls its limbs close, stiffens its body, and rolls down the slope. Instead of making a risky leap across sharp, wet rock, it turns itself into a small, bouncing object. The behavior may look ridiculous, but in its environment, it makes remarkable sense. This is what isolation can produce. Nature does not necessarily create giant monsters. It creates precise solutions to precise problems. The pebble toad's unusual behavior is perfectly suited to the terrain where it lives. Roraima's strange life eventually attracted attention far beyond South America. Reports from the summit sounded like descriptions of a hidden world where unusual creatures survived above the clouds. The mountain became associated with Arthur Conan Doyle's 1912 novel, The Lost World. Roraima is widely regarded as one of the real inspirations behind the fictional plateau where prehistoric creatures survive in isolation. But scientists never discovered dinosaurs living on Roraima. The real mountain was already fascinating enough. Its cliffs, isolation, geology, and strange animals created the perfect ingredients for the lost world idea. For decades, the scientific explanation also seemed straightforward. The tepui summits were viewed as islands in the sky. Their steep cliffs appeared to have isolated their organisms for enormous periods of time. The theory made sense. If a species lived on top of a mountain surrounded by cliffs, it seemed reasonable to assume that it had been trapped there for millions of years. Roraima seemed to support this idea particularly well. Many species had extremely small ranges, and some occurred only on individual mountains. The summit looked like a biological island. But there was a problem. Much of the explanation came from geography. Scientists could see the cliffs, but they could not simply look at the landscape and determine exactly when the organisms became isolated. Then DNA offered a new way to investigate the mystery. In 2012, a team led by Patricia Salerno published research on highland tree frogs from the Guiana Shield. Instead of asking whether the mountains looked isolated, researchers asked how long the frog lineages had actually been separated. That is a crucial difference. A landscape can look completely isolated today, while having been much more connected in the past. Climate changes, habitats shift, pathways disappear. Conditions that exist now may not have existed millions of years ago. The researchers used DNA to estimate when different frog lineages diverged. This approach is often called a molecular clock. Genetic differences can provide clues about how long populations have been evolving separately. If the traditional lost world explanation were completely correct, some summit species should have extremely ancient divergence dates corresponding to the deep history of the tepuis. But the DNA told a different story. The highland tree frog lineages studied appeared surprisingly young compared with the age of the rocks. Their divergence times were estimated at roughly 2 to 5 million years. That is ancient from a human perspective, but compared with rocks nearly 2 billion years old, it is incredibly recent. Think about the contradiction. The mountain is almost 2 billion years old. Its cliffs look like barriers that could have remained untouched for ages, yet some of the organisms living there appear to have separated only a few million years ago. This changed the story. And the summit could still be extremely isolated, but total and uninterrupted isolation could no longer explain everything. Somehow, life had apparently moved between highland environments much later than the geological formation of the mountain. How did tiny frogs cross such difficult terrain? There may not be one simple answer. One possibility is that past climates changed the ecology of the region. During cooler and wetter periods, habitats suitable for certain highland species may have expanded, allowing organisms to move farther than they can today. Another possibility is that ancient pathways once existed between areas that now appear completely separated. Ridges, saddles, slopes, or other connections could have provided routes that later disappeared through erosion and geological change. There is also a broader lesson. Animals do not follow the clean boundaries we draw on maps. Given enough time, changing climates and rare environmental opportunities can allow organisms to cross barriers that appear almost impossible today. This is why Roraima's story is really a lesson in science itself. Scientists develop explanations from available evidence. Then new evidence can challenge those explanations. When that happens, the explanation becomes more accurate. The older Lost World story was beautiful. Ancient rocks, isolated summits, and creatures trapped above the clouds. But the newer story may be even more fascinating because it includes movement, climate change, adaptation, and repeated periods of isolation. Instead of imagining Roraima as a sealed box, imagine it as a fortress with rare cracks. Most of the time, the barriers were powerful, but occasionally conditions may have created opportunities for life to pass through. The summit is therefore not necessarily a frozen museum. It may be a place where species arrived, adapted, became isolated, and changed over time. The carnivorous plants are not simply relics from an unimaginably ancient world. They are solutions to the difficult conditions of the summit. The pebble toad is not a creature preserved unchanged from deep geological history. It is an active response to the environment around it. Even the phrase island in the sky becomes more complicated. Real islands are rarely completely isolated. Birds cross them, seeds travel through the air, storms move organisms. Life constantly finds opportunities that are difficult for humans to see. The 2012 DNA research does not mean Roraima was easy for animals to reach. It suggests something more precise. At least some lineages did not experience complete, uninterrupted isolation for their entire history. There's a huge difference between being difficult to cross and being impossible to cross. That distinction matters because humans naturally prefer absolute stories. We like to describe places as completely isolated, untouched, ancient, or perfectly preserved. Nature is usually more complicated. The estimated 2 to 5 million year divergence times suggest that some of the remarkable diversity of these mountains may have developed much more recently than the rocks themselves. The Pliocene becomes important in this picture. It was a much later period in Earth's history when climates and habitats were changing. Those changes may have created opportunities for species to spread and later become isolated again. This gives us one of the most important lessons from Roraima. Ancient rocks do not automatically mean ancient ecosystems. A landscape can be billions of years old while the organisms living there are much younger. Life responds to changing environments, not simply to the age of the stone beneath it. Roraima may therefore contain two timelines at once. Its rocks preserve an almost unimaginably ancient geological history, while its organisms reveal a much more recent story of movement, adaptation, and isolation. And that does not make the mountain less mysterious. It makes it more fascinating. The real lost world may not be a hidden Jurassic kingdom filled with dinosaurs. It may be the lost geography of the past, the ancient climates, habitats, and pathways that once connected places that now appear completely separated. When you stand beneath Roraima's enormous cliffs, the mountain looks like a fortress that has been sealed for billions of years. But the DNA of the creatures living above those cliffs tells a more complicated story. Somewhere in the distant past, life appears to have found a way through. And perhaps that is the greatest mystery of Mount Roraima. The mountain looks like a place where time stopped, but its biology suggests that time never stopped at all. Life continued moving, adapting, separating, and changing. Roraima is therefore more than an ancient mountain, and more than the inspiration for a famous lost world story. It is a living record of how geology and evolution interact across immense periods of time. The rocks may be nearly 2 billion years old, but the story written in the DNA of the animals living there is much younger. And that may be the strangest discovery of all. The lost world was never completely lost. It was changing the entire time. The rock on Mount Roraima began forming nearly 2 billion years ago. That means it was already ancient before complex animals filled the sea. Its summit sits high above the forest behind walls of dark sandstone and cloud. For years, people treated that summit like a sealed world. Then, DNA said otherwise. By the time we reach the end, you will see why one of Earth's most famous lost worlds is even stranger than the story people first told about it. Picture a mountain that does not rise like a normal peak. It rises like a fortress. The sides shoot up in sheer walls. The top looks cut flat, like a giant table left out in the rain for ages beyond imagining. Mount Roraima stands where Venezuela, Brazil, and Guyana meet. It is part of a group of mountains called tepuis. These are flat-topped sandstone plateaus that tower above the surrounding land like islands in the sky. Even from far away, Roraima feels wrong in the best way. Clouds snag on its edges, water spills off its sides. The whole thing looks less like a mountain and more like a broken piece of another planet. The summit spreads across about 31 square kilometers. That is a lot of space to hide a separate world. It is big enough that once you are up there, the rest of the continent can feel very far away. And the age changes how you see it. The sandstone belongs to the ancient Guyana Shield. Some of that rock dates to roughly 1.95 to 1.78 billion years ago. When those sediments were laid down, life on Earth was still simple. There were no forests then, no birds, no mammals, not even the first dinosaurs, because dinosaurs were still unimaginably far in the future. Roraima's deep history does not just stretch backward, it crushes the scale we usually think in. Over immense spans of time, layers built up, hardened, lifted, and then slowly wore away. Wind and water cut into the old plateau. What remained were isolated blocks, flat on top and steep at the edges. That is how the tepuis took shape. So, when you look at Mount Roraima, you are not looking at a young, sharp mountain range still rising fast. You are looking at a survivor, a remnant, a last piece of something much larger that has mostly been erased. The local Pemon people knew this landscape long before scientists mapped it. For them, the tepuis were never ordinary cliffs. The word tepui is often translated as house of the gods. Roraima itself is tied to old stories about a great tree and a changed world. In one Pemon tradition, Roraima is linked to the stump of a mighty tree that once held all the fruits and vegetables of the world. A culture can tell truth in the language of myth, And in a strange way, that old story points toward a real idea. These mountains were once part of one connected mass. That part matters, because later, modern science would say something close in its own language. The plateaus do share a common origin. They are separated now, but they were not always separate. For people approaching from the lowlands, though, none of that geology was the first thing they noticed. They saw the cliffs, they saw the scale, they saw a wall that seemed to say no. For most of recorded history, Mount Roraima's summit was effectively unreachable to outsiders. Its cliffs rise hundreds of meters. They are wet, slick, and broken by mist. Even if you knew where to go, the mountain still had to let you pass. That is why Roraima gathered myths so easily. Not because people were foolish, because inaccessible places invite stories. If nobody can climb a place, your mind starts climbing for you. In 1884, that changed. British explorer Everard Thurn, traveling with Harry Perkins and guided through the region with crucial local knowledge, found a natural sloping route. It was not easy, it was simply possible. That ramp is the hinge of the whole story. Without it, Roraima stays a silhouette. With it, the mountain becomes a place you can enter, suffer through, and finally stand on. Imagine the approach. Days through open savanna and thick forest, rain that does not ask permission, mud that grips your boots, the mountain always ahead of you, never seeming to get closer in the way normal mountains do. Then the wall fills the sky. You do not see a summit, you see a barricade. Water runs down black stone, moss clings to cracks. The clouds lower until the whole mountain seems to pull its own weather around itself. The climb up the ramp is not a clean, heroic line. It is wet, it is awkward, it is slippery. You crawl, brace, and pick each step. And all the while you know this route exists only because the mountain did not quite finish closing the door. When Thurn and Perkins reached the top, they stepped into a place that seemed made to confuse the human eye. The ground was not soft alpine grass. It was hard stone, sculpted into channels, ridges, hollows, and pools by endless rain. That terrain matters more than it first appears. It is not just dramatic scenery. It shapes every living thing up there. It decides who can survive, how they move, and what strange solutions evolution might invent. The summit is often cold, especially at night. It is windy. It is soaked. The soil is thin in many places. Water is everywhere, yet nutrients can be hard to find. It is a tough life support system. And that is when Roraima becomes more than a mountain story. It becomes a biological puzzle. Because isolation plus pressure is one of nature's favorite ways to create the unexpected. Over time, explorers, naturalists, and scientists describe plants and animals found there and nowhere else. Endemic is the formal word. It means a species lives in one place and one place only. Roraima is full of that kind of life. Some of the plants turned carnivorous. They trap insects because the ground gives them too little nutrition. Instead of waiting for the soil to help, they changed the rules and started feeding in another way. That sounds dramatic, but it is not fantasy. It is adaptation. If a plant lives where the ground offers almost nothing, then grabbing nutrients from insects can be the difference between surviving and failing. Some frogs use those plants too. The water caught inside them becomes shelter. The little pockets of moisture become nurseries. On top of a stone world, even a leaf can turn into real estate. Then there are the toads, tiny, dark, easy to mistake for a loose pebble until they move. The most famous is the pebble toad, and its escape plan sounds invented until you watch what it does. Most frogs and toads hop. That is what your brain expects. Powerful back legs, quick leap, clean getaway. But on wet, hard rock, a bad landing can be deadly. So the pebble toad does something else. When threatened, it tucks in its limbs, stiffens its body, and rolls. Not metaphorically. It literally turns itself into a small bouncing stone and tumbles away down the slope. It is one of those moments when the natural world seems to grin at you. Because, of course, that is absurd. And of course, it also makes perfect sense. A normal leap on sharp rock is a gamble. A controlled tumble may be safer. Over many generations, a body plan and behavior that fit the summit could win out over the classic frog escape move. And that is the magic of real isolation. It does not produce movie monsters. It produces precise weirdness. Tiny, local, practical weirdness. The kind that only makes sense in one exact place. This is one reason Mount Roraima captured imaginations far beyond South America. The reports from its summit sounded like dispatches from a hidden realm. The mountain became linked with the idea that somewhere on Earth, time could pool and hold on. That link reached one very famous writer. Mount Roraima is widely regarded as one of the real inspirations behind Arthur Conan Doyle's 1912 novel, The Lost World. In that story, explorers reach an isolated South American plateau where prehistoric creatures still survive. No, scientists never found dinosaurs on Roraima. The mountain did not contain a living Jurassic Park behind the clouds. But you can feel why people wanted it to. The shape was right. The remoteness was real. The biology was already strange. And once a place earns the label Lost World, every new discovery on that summit starts to sound like the next page of a legend. But legends can hide a quieter truth. Sometimes the real shock is not what lives there. It is how it got there. For decades, the standard picture seemed obvious. Tepui summits were islands in the sky. They were ancient. They were cut off by cliffs. The species on top must have been trapped there for immense spans of time, evolving alone. It felt elegant. It felt logical. And it matched what your eyes told you. If the walls are that steep, then surely the life above them has been sealed off for ages. That idea shaped how many scientists and writers talked about these mountains. Each summit became a natural laboratory of isolation. A stone raft floating over the forest, a place where ancient lineages held on while the world changed below. At first glance, Roraima fit the model almost too well. Its summit life was specialized. Many species had tiny ranges. Some occurred only on one mountain. What else could explain that except long total separation? But there was a problem hiding inside that confidence. The model sounded right. Yet for a long time it had not been tested in the most direct way available. People had inferred the story from geography. They had not fully asked the genes. That gap is where the mountain opened again. In 2012, a team led by Patricia Salerno published a study on highland tree frogs from the Guiana Shield. They were not asking whether the tepuis looked isolated. Everyone could see that. They were asking how long the lineages on those summits had actually been separate. The difference is huge. A mountain can look sealed now and still have a more complicated past. Landscapes change. Climates swing. Pathways appear and disappear. What seems impossible in the present may not have been impossible millions of years ago. Salerno and her colleagues used DNA to estimate when these frog lineages split from each other. This is often called a molecular clock. The phrase sounds technical, but the basic idea is simple. Genes change over time. Not at the same pace in every detail, and not with perfect precision, but enough that scientists can compare populations and estimate how long ago they shared a common ancestor. More difference usually means deeper separation. Less difference points to a more recent split. If the old Lost World model was fully right, then summit frog lineages should have been incredibly old. They should have traced their separation far back, perhaps to the deep history of plateau fragmentation itself. That is not what the team found. Instead, the highland tree frogs they studied appeared surprisingly young. Their divergence times were on the order of about 2 to 5 million years. That is ancient by human standards. But compared with the age of the rocks, it is almost yesterday. Think about that for a second. The stone is nearly 2 billion years old. The mountaintop looks untouchable. The story says ancient biological isolation. And the genes answer with something more recent, more restless, and more dynamic. That is the turning point. Because once that result lands, the whole mountain changes shape in your mind. The summit is still remote. The cliffs are still real.